said that Covenanters have had differing opinions on eschatology or baptism and all of that, and we're able to somehow live together. Then sexuality comes, and it's all of a sudden, we can't deal with this. And maybe before I kind of get to that point,
okay,
something happened also that kind of, I mean, this has been an issue, but obviously it's been building, and that led to something in 2019 that again has a Twin Cities connection.
Right. So maybe the larger background to say is what you alluded to, Dennis, which is I think the covenant for a long time prided itself on its ability to stay together and not be torn apart by issues that historically have torn Protestants generally apart, American Protestants apart, evangelicals apart. So like a classic case is baptism, right? I was baptized when I was 5 weeks old, right? But I also have been to covenant churches that primarily practice believers' baptism. And they function with the Baptist kind of polity. I mean, at certain points, not that far back in church history, that's a terribly divisive issue to the point in the Reformation, the 16th century, where, my pedobaptistic forebears are burning Anabaptists at the stake, right? Like, and, even after some of that violence abates, that's still a dividing line. That's a bright red line. One of those is right, and you've got to pick which side you're going to be on. But, at least in the last, I think at least 30 years or so, my understanding was that to be ordained as a covenant pastor, you had to be willing to perform both modes of baptism. That you had to expect that if you led a congregation, you might have people who affirm both of those beliefs. You have to honor both of them. And, the theologian in me, and there's not much of a theologian in me, but part of me wants to say, well, can these both actually be true? Does that fit? And I think what covenant theologians would say is, well, Scripture leaves room for both, right? Like you can make a case, and then you can also appeal to tradition, to theological argumentation, and can't we honor both? Is that not possible? The other kind of classic case that often has been made during the sexuality debate is on the eve of World War II. The Covenant Church goes out of its way, really, to affirm both just war and pacifism as Christian ethical principles. And they did this partly because there actually was a system of conscientious objection for World War II. And so I don't think there were a lot of pacifists in the Covenant at that point, but they wanted to create space for those folks to say that, we affirm this, and you can go to your draft board and say that this is a sincerely held religious conviction. And even though most of us in the covenant are going to go off and serve, we're going to send chaplains in, and we're going to go fight in the military, we believe that this is a genuine Christian conclusion that you've arrived at. It's a way of following Jesus Christ. We'll honor it. And I think that's usually been the spirit of the covenant, is almost to enjoy living in this tension, right? Whether it's, like you said, eschatology. A lot of covenanters are premillennial, but you'll find post-millennial, amillennial, and everything else, if there's anything else on the spectrum, right? And then I would say in the last 15 years, I don't know if I can precisely date when this really becomes a difficult problem in the covenant, a debate breaks out over human sexuality. So I think the covenant had actually addressed this to some extent, maybe around the turn of the century. I forget if it was the late 90s or actually earlier. The way the covenant functions is that every summer there's an annual meeting, and every congregation sends a certain number of delegates. And actually, that's what governs the covenant. There's an executive committee with a kind of church bureaucracy of a small size. But if you want to make changes in covenant doctrine, in covenant polity, in covenant anything, it's the annual meeting that has to do it. But normally, the annual meeting doesn't really make big changes to covenant affirmations, to covenant doctrinal points. It usually will affirm a resolution of some sort, which there have been covenant resolutions on environmental protection, on racial justice, on the capital punishment. And no one is bound by them. They're just the statement of the sense of that annual meeting of here's where we are as a denomination, here's how we're wrestling with this issue, here's why we think it's important. And so there was a statement on human sexuality that affirmed chastity and singleness, and then within the bonds of a male-female marriage. But that's been about 20-some years. I think in many respects, it's a very different society now. And not just because of the Obergefell reading, but I think especially among younger Covenanters and younger evangelicals, attitudes have changed significantly. I think many more of them actually know people who are LGBTQ, right? And I think that's caused some serious rethinking, and as importantly, rereading of Scripture. And and I think a lot of those Covenanters then expected, well, the way we'll address this then is the way we've addressed baptism or participation in warfare or eschatology. Is we've got these sincerely held beliefs that both appeal to Scripture, both are motivated by love of God and love of neighbor, and so we'll find a way to disagree because that's what we've always done. And instead, what happened was it became clear that leadership at varying levels had decided this was not something that Covenanters could disagree on, or at the very least, the covenant clergy could not disagree. And so like the mechanics of this get a little bit difficult for me even to explain because I'm not sure I fully understand them. You probably need to talk to a covenant pastor to really get it right. But there's in the covenant what's called a board of ordered ministry that reviews candidates for ordination, but also deals with allegations of abuse, of harassment, of infidelity. So there is a kind of a set of ethical guidelines binding pastors that's been around for a while. And at a certain point, one of those guidelines became that as a pastor, you could not publicly contradict the denomination's stance on human sexuality, either by something you did or, for example, by presiding at a same-gender, same-sex marriage. Right? And so this starts to become an issue in the last really 7 years because there are certain pastors and certain congregations that become affirming churches. And their pastors do preside at marriages. And they also go out of the way to include statements of inclusion in their public materials. They don't just welcome LGBT Christians into the congregation, but say that all roles are open, from clergy down to congregational leadership to anything else. So where I think this really becomes difficult is that a congregation called First Covenant of Minneapolis becomes an affirming church. And actually, its current pastor is a lesbian Black woman, right? But before that even happened, the white pastor had said, I affirm in all respects my LGBTQ brethren. I'm going to marry same-sex marriages, and we welcome all into this community. And over a period of time, that got him into trouble with his local conference and then with the Board of Ordered Ministry. And there was also another pastor who had presided at the marriage of his son to another man. That was the other case that was bound up in this. And so I think all sides tried to find some compromise resolution, but at a certain point, they reached this impasse, right? The pastor and the congregation would not back down from what they felt was their sincere belief as Covenanters, as Christians, that this is God's intention, that we affirm all people made in God's image, and we don't put up barriers unnecessarily, and we affirm love, right? And the denomination said, no, you violated, pastor, your ethical guidelines, and if you will not voluntarily either change your position or voluntarily withdraw from the denomination, there is a procedure to involuntarily dismiss congregations from the covenant, and the Board of Ordered Ministry can take away someone's credentials as clergy, and both of those things happened at the annual meeting in Omaha.